This is a boring history video made for sleep. You don't need to listen closely. You don't need to remember anything. There will be no loud sounds. No dramatic moments. No surprises. This video will continue slowly and quietly until the very end. Even if you fall asleep halfway through, that is completely fine. If falling asleep to slow stories like this feels comfortable to you, there are many more that sound the same on this channel. Tonight may not be the last time. Tonight, we will simply spend some time in a quiet moment from the past. Nothing important is going to happen. Just let the words fade into the background. And now, we begin. Did you know that when Marco Polo returned to Venice after 24 years, his own family didn't recognize him, mistaking the weary traveler in tattered Tartar robes for a beggar? This journey wasn't a sprint across continents, but a slow, rhythmic immersion into the unknown, where time was measured not by clocks, but by the shifting sands of the Gobi and the phases of the moon. In this series of 33 chapters, we will follow Marco's odyssey along the Silk Road. We will witness the transition from the salty Mediterranean breeze to the frozen silence of the Pamir Mountains and the humid depths of the East. This is not a tale of battles, but a sensory exploration of a world that, to the medieval mind, felt like another planet. The salt-crusted wood of the galley creaked under the weight of crates filled with Venetian glass and Mediterranean wine, marking the final moments of a familiar world. As the sun dipped below the horizon of Acre, casting a long, golden shadow across the harbor, Marco Polo watched the last vestiges of European architecture fade into a hazy silhouette. He was 17, standing between a father he barely knew and an uncle who spoke of the East as if it were a land made of dreams rather than soil. The air here was heavy, thick with the scent of frankincense and the brine of the Levant, a sharp contrast to the damp, cold canals of Venice. His journey did not begin with a gallop, but with a deliberate, rhythmic pace that dictated the rest of his life. Every step taken by the pack horses away from the coast felt like a tether snapping. The transition from the sea to the land was a slow transformation of the senses. The sound of crashing waves was gradually replaced by the dry rustle of olive groves and the distant, melodic clinking of camel bells. There was no rush in their movements. The Polos understood that to survive the Silk Road, one had to surrender to its pulse. They moved through the outskirts of the Crusader states, where the dust of the road began to coat their fine silks, turning the vibrant reds and blues into the earthy ochre of the Syrian desert. As the first month of their trek unfolded, the landscape began to shed its greenery. The lush coastal plains gave way to rolling hills of parched earth and limestone outcrops. Marco spent his hours observing the way the light changed. In Italy, the sky felt like a solid blue dome, but here, it seemed to expand into an infinite, pale void. He watched his father, Niccolò, negotiate with local caravanserai masters, their voices a low murmur against the backdrop of braying livestock. The young traveler realized that the world was far larger than any map in a monastery could ever depict. Each mile was a lesson in patience, a slow peeling back of the veil that separated the known from the legendary. The nights were the most profound change of all. Far from the lanterns of the Rialto, the darkness was absolute, broken only by the shimmering carpet of stars that seemed close enough to touch. Sitting by the low embers of a dung fire, Marco felt the immense silence of the East beginning to settle in his bones. It was a silence that didn't feel empty, but rather full of the ghosts of 1,000 years of merchants who had trodden this same path. The journey was no longer a destination to be reached, it had become a state of being, a slow, deliberate crawl toward the rising sun. The path began to tilt upward, leading the caravan away from the scorching plains and toward the rugged, iron-colored mountains of the Armenian highlands. The air grew thin and crisp, carrying the scent of wild thyme and cold stone. This was a land of ancient shadows, where the sun seemed to burn brighter yet provided less warmth. Marco observed how the horses strained, their breath forming small clouds of mist in the morning chill, marking the transition from the humid coast to the skeletal beauty of the interior. The slow pace of the caravan became even more deliberate, every step was a calculation against the loose scree and the narrowing mountain passes. As they moved deeper into the highlands, the vibrant bustle of the Mediterranean ports felt like a memory from another life. Here, the landscape was dominated by the silent majesty of Mount Ararat, its snow-capped peak haunting the horizon like a stationary white wave. Marco watched the local herdsmen, draped in thick sheepskin cloaks, moving their flocks across the treacherous slopes with a rhythmic grace that matched the ticking of the seasons. There was no urgency in their movements, only a profound endurance. The young Venetian began to understand that in these heights, time was not measured by hours, but by the distance between one watering hole and the next. The architecture of the world changed around them. Stone fortresses, weathered by centuries of wind and forgotten wars, clung to the cliffs like predatory birds. The colors of the earth shifted from the dusty ochre of the lowlands to deep purples, slate grays, and the startling green of hidden alpine valleys. In these pockets of life, the caravan would pause, allowing the animals to graze on the rich, short grass. Marco spent these long afternoons documenting the flora, marveling at flowers that bloomed briefly between the frosts. The silence of the mountains was heavy, broken only by the occasional cry of an eagle or the distant rumble of a rockslide, reminding the travelers of their insignificance. As the month progressed, the nights became a test of spirit. The wind would howl through the canyons, searching for gaps in their tents, carrying the bite of the approaching winter. They huddled around small fires, the flickering light dancing on the walls of ancient caravanserais that had sheltered travelers since the time of the Caesars. Marco felt a strange peace in this isolation. The world of commerce and politics had vanished, replaced by the basic necessities of warmth, water, and the steady, plodding rhythm of the trail. They were no longer mere merchants, they were becoming part of the landscape itself, a slow-moving line of shadows etching their way across the roof of the world. The descent from the Armenian highlands was a gradual unwinding, a slow release from the grip of the cold mountain air. The wind, once sharp and biting, softened into a warm, dry breath that carried the faint, metallic tang of salt. The formidable stone fortresses gave way to mud brick villages, their flat roofs baking under an increasingly intense sun. Marco felt the shift in temperature almost physically, as if shedding layers of an old skin. The vibrant greens and grays of the mountains were replaced by an endless palette of beige and rust, stretching to a horizon that shimmered with deceptive mirages. They entered the vast, undulating expanse of the Persian salt deserts, a landscape that was both beautiful and terrifying in its immensity. Here, the ground crackled underfoot, a crust of white crystal stretching for miles, reflecting the sunlight with a blinding intensity. The air hung heavy and still, the silence profound, broken only by the soft padding of camel hooves and the occasional creak of saddle leather. The slow pace of the caravan became a meditative rhythm, a careful navigation through a world that offered little in the way of landmark or relief. Marco learned to discern the subtle changes in the sand, the way the wind sculpted delicate ripples, guiding their path. Water became the most precious commodity, carefully rationed and always on their minds. They moved from one oasis to the next, each a miraculous explosion of date palms and cool, life-giving springs, appearing like emeralds set in a desert of gold. These stops were moments of profound relief, where the animals could drink deeply and the travelers could wash the fine, pervasive dust from their skin. Marco observed the intricate systems of qanats, ancient underground aqueducts that brought water from distant mountains, a testament to human ingenuity against the unforgiving environment. He realized that this was not an empty land, but one shaped by generations of struggle and adaptation. As the month wore on, they began to encounter the first of the great cities of Persia, their ancient walls rising from the desert like improbable fortresses. The cities were hives of activity, filled with the aroma of spices, the vibrant dyes of textiles, and the complex melodies of a language Marco did not yet understand. The slow journey had prepared him for these contrasts. The abrupt shift from the raw, silent desert to the intricate, noisy bazaars was less a shock and more a natural progression. He watched, fascinated, as merchants from all corners of the known world bartered for goods, a living map unfolding before his eyes. The journey was a continuous lesson in patience and observation, a slow immersion into the heart of a continent. The landscape began to soften as the caravan moved deeper into the heart of Persia, trading the harsh, crystalline glare of the salt flats for the rhythmic geometry of cultivated valleys. The earth here was a rich, burnt sienna, and the air carried the perfume of drying fruit and rosewater. This was the month of the Great Gardens, where the slow pace of the journey allowed Marco to witness the ingenious ways the locals tamed the arid climate. High, mud brick walls shielded hidden paradises of pomegranate trees and cypress groves, their dark shadows offering a coolness that felt like a physical weight against the afternoon sun. The architecture of the cities they approached began to change, reflecting a newfound sophistication. Instead of the utilitarian stone of the highlands, the horizons were now pierced by slender minarets and the first glimpses of blue-tiled domes that mirrored the cloudless sky. Marco marveled at the transition. It was as if the very dust of the road was being refined into something celestial. The caravan moved with a sluggish grace through the outskirts of Yazd, passing by the towering wind catchers that rose like silent stone chimneys to pull the desert breeze into the homes below. Every structure told a story of a civilization that did not fight the environment, but moved in harmony with it. Life in the bazaars of the interior was a slow-motion kaleidoscope of color and sound. Marco watched the weavers, their fingers moving with a blurred speed that defied the heavy heat, creating carpets that seemed to contain entire landscapes within their intricate knots. The dyes, indigo from the east, madder root from the west, were a testament to the city's role as a vital organ in the body of the Silk Road. The young traveler found himself mesmerized by the master metalworkers who hammered sheets of copper into ornate vessels, the rhythmic clink-clink-clink echoing through the narrow alleys like a heartbeat. There were no shortcuts here, beauty was a byproduct of time and immense patience. As the night settled over the Persian plains, the temperature dropped to a comfortable, velvet coolness. The caravan would often camp near the ruins of old monuments, where the pillars of fallen empires stood as silent witnesses to their passage. Sitting under the vast, star-flecked canopy, Marco listened to the elders recount legends of the kings who once ruled this land, their voices blending with the soft rustle of the horses grazing on dry scrub. He realized that the journey was not just a movement through space, but a movement through history. They were treading upon layers of forgotten eras, their slow, deliberate progress a small, temporary mark on a map that had been drawn and redrawn for thousands of years. The descent toward the coast was a slow plunge into a different kind of intensity. As the caravan moved south from the Persian heartland, the dry, aromatic air of the highlands was replaced by a heavy, salt-laden humidity that clung to the skin like a damp shroud. The mountains finally crumbled into low, scorched hills, revealing the vast, metallic sheen of the Persian Gulf. This was the month of the great heat, where the sun did not just shine but seemed to press down upon the world with an invisible weight. Marco watched the horizon dissolve into a white haze where the sky and the sea met in an indistinguishable blur. Hormuz rose from the coastline as a city of contradictions, a bustling, wealthy port set upon an island of barren rock and salt. The slow pace of the pack animals reached its final cadence at the water's edge, where the rhythmic thud of hooves on sand was replaced by the chaotic symphony of a world-class harbor. Marco stood on the docks, mesmerized by the sight of ships unlike any he had seen in Venice. These were the dhows, their planks not nailed together but sewn with twine made from coconut husks, their lateen sails billowing like the wings of great white birds. The air here was a thick soup of odors, rotting fish, pungent ambergris, and the sharp, sweet scent of dates fermenting in the sun. The people of this coastal gateway were a tapestry of the Indian Ocean's reach. Marco observed merchants in thin, white tunics, their skin darkened by a sun far more unforgiving than that of the Adriatic. He saw goods arriving from the distant east, spices that stung the nostrils and silks that felt like water between the fingers. Because of the extreme heat, the city moved in a unique, nocturnal rhythm. During the day, the streets were ghost-like, the inhabitants retreating into the shadows of their homes or beneath the cooling systems of their wind towers. Only as the sun dipped low did the city exhale, the bazaars coming alive under the flicker of oil lamps. This month was one of waiting and observation. The Polos had originally intended to continue by sea, but the sight of the fragile, sewn vessels filled them with a rare hesitation. Marco spent his days studying the tides and the strange, iridescent fish that darted in the shallow, turquoise waters. He realized that the Silk Road was not a single path, but a network of arteries, some made of dust and others of brine. Even in this pause, the journey continued within him, he was learning the language of the monsoon winds and the temperament of the southern stars. The slow, deliberate transition from the solid earth to the fluid uncertainty of the sea marked another layer of his transformation. The decision to abandon the fragile, sewn ships of Hormuz marked a pivotal shift in the journey's rhythm. Turning their backs to the humid, sapphire waters of the Gulf, the caravan began a slow, arduous trek back into the rugged interior, aiming for the legendary heights of the Pamir Mountains. This was the month of the Great Climb, where the sweltering heat of the coast was gradually traded for an air so thin and cold it felt like inhaling shards of glass. The landscape stripped itself of luxury, the lush date palms and vibrant bazaars vanished, replaced by a vertical wilderness of slate-colored rock and permanent ice. As they ascended, the world shrank into a narrow trail carved into the ribs of the earth. Marco observed how the horses were replaced by sure-footed yaks, shaggy beasts whose slow, rhythmic grunting became the soundtrack of their days. The ascent was a study in patience. For every mile gained, the lungs had to fight for the right to breathe. The vegetation became sparse and resilient, consisting of nothing more than pale lichens and tiny, wind-blasted shrubs that clung to the crevices. There were no trees here to break the wind, which roared down from the peaks with the force of an unseen ocean. The isolation was absolute. Up here, on the roof of the world, the sky was no longer a distant canopy but an immediate, terrifying presence, turning a deep, bruised indigo even in the middle of the day. Marco marveled at the silence, a silence so profound it seemed to have a weight of its own. It was a place where fire refused to burn with its usual vigor and where water boiled at a lukewarm temperature, defying the common sense of the lowlands. The slow movement of the caravan across the high plateaus was the only sign of life in a landscape that seemed to belong to the primordial past. At night, the cold was a physical predator, gnawing at the edges of their heavy felt tents. They slept in layers of wolf skin and thick wool, listening to the glaciers groan and crack in the distance like the breaking of giant bones. Marco realized that this was the true crucible of the Silk Road, a place where only the most patient and determined could survive. The slow transition from the sweltering shores of the south to the frozen heights of the north had tempered his spirit, stripping away the last vestiges of the sheltered Venetian youth. He was now a creature of the road, moving in sync with the ancient, unhurried pulse of the mountains. The descent from the frozen ramparts of the Pamirs was a slow, jarring transition from the vertical to the horizontal. As the peaks receded into a jagged white line behind them, the world opened up into the vast, terrifying bowl of the Darim Basin. The biting chill of the heights dissolved, replaced by a dry, parching heat that seemed to rise from the very earth. This was the month of the shifting sands, where the caravan entered the fringes of the Taklamakan, a name that whispered, once you go in, you never come out. The landscape was no longer made of solid rock, but of liquid dunes that moved and sighed under the influence of the constant, whistling wind. Marco watched as the horizon became a blurred haze of fine, yellow dust. The slow pace of the yaks was now replaced by the rhythmic, swaying gait of Bactrian camels, the true kings of the Silk Road. These two-humped giants moved with a deliberate, stoic grace, their broad feet splaying across the soft sand like snowshoes. The transition was sensory. The smell of cold snow was replaced by the scent of hot alkali and the faint, sweet aroma of dry scrub. Marco observed how the sun transformed the dunes into a sea of fire at sunset, the shadows stretching out like long, dark fingers across the ribbed surface of the desert. Survival in this month depended on the knowledge of the singing sands. Marco listened to the strange, low hum caused by the wind moving across the dunes, a sound that local legends attributed to desert spirits calling travelers to their doom. The caravan moved with extreme caution, navigating from one buried well to the next, often traveling by night to avoid the soul-crushing heat of the midday sun. The stars above were their only map, burning with a fierce, steady light in the dry air. Marco felt the immensity of the desert pressing in on him, a void so vast that the long line of their caravan seemed like a single, fragile thread of life in a dead world. As they reached the first of the oasis towns on the desert's edge, like Kashgar, the change was miraculous. The dust-choked air was suddenly broken by the sound of running water and the sight of tall poplars. These islands of green were the only thing that made the sea of death traversable. Marco spent his time observing the local inhabitants, whose faces bore the marks of both the steppe and the distant east. He realized that the desert was not a barrier, but a filter, allowing only the most resilient ideas, goods, and people to pass through. The slow, rhythmic pulse of the desert had become his own, a steady heartbeat in the face of the infinite. Leaving the bustling markets of Kashgar behind, the caravan traced the southern hem of the Taklamakan, where the desert met the foothills of the Kunlun Mountains. This was the month of the hidden treasures, a slow drift along the edge of an empire of sand toward the legendary oasis of Khotan. The air here was a curious mixture of the desert's dry heat and a cool, refreshing breeze that tumbled down from the snow-capped peaks to the south. Marco noticed how the color of the world shifted again. The monochromatic yellows of the dunes were now punctuated by the sparkling, icy ribbons of rivers that carved their way through the arid plains. These rivers were the lifeblood of the region, and Marco spent hours watching the locals wade into the shallow, rushing waters of the White Jade River. They moved with a slow, meditative focus, their eyes searching the riverbed for the smooth, milky stones that had been washed down from the mountains over millennia. This was the source of the fabled jade, a stone more precious than gold to the people of the East. Marco observed the craftsmen in the village workshops, their weathered hands using simple tools to grind and polish the raw boulders into delicate, translucent works of art. There was no rush in their craft, like the journey itself, the beauty of the jade was revealed only through tireless, rhythmic persistence. The greenery of Khotan was a lush defiance of the surrounding void. Massive mulberry trees cast deep, cooling shadows over the canals, and the air was filled with the rhythmic thumping of looms. This was a land of silk and ancient secrets, where the slow pace of life allowed for the cultivation of delicate traditions. Marco watched the transformation of the silkworm cocoons into shimmering threads, a process as methodical and patient as the caravan's trek across the continent. He realized that the Silk Road was not just a path of transit, but a string of these vibrant pearls, each oasis a world unto itself, preserved by the very isolation that made reaching them so difficult. At night, the camp was pitched near the edge of the orchards, where the scent of ripening fruit blended with the smell of wood smoke. The mountains to the south loomed like dark, silent giants, shielding the valley from the worst of the desert storms. Marco felt the weight of history here more than anywhere else. Khotan had seen the passage of monks, conquerors, and merchants for 1,000 years. His own presence was merely a heartbeat in the long life of the oasis. As he looked out over the moonlit dunes that stretched toward the north, he felt a deepening respect for the slow, inexorable flow of time that governed this ancient land. The transition from the sheltered orchards of the southern oases to the mouth of the Gobi Desert was a slow fading of color into a world of monochromatic vastness. As the caravan moved east, the protective wall of the Kunlun Mountains began to recede, leaving the travelers exposed to a horizon that felt stretched to the breaking point. This was the month of the great emptiness, where the landscape was no longer defined by dunes or peaks, but by a flat, gravelly expanse that seemed to lead to the very edge of the earth. The air became exceptionally dry, so devoid of moisture that the wood of their wagons groaned and the leather of their boots stiffened into iron. Marco observed a new kind of silence here, not the muffled silence of the sand, but a ringing, crystalline stillness that made the sound of a falling stone echo like a crack of thunder. The slow pace of the camels became even more vital, for in the Gobi, energy was a currency more valuable than silver. The animals plodded with a heavy, metronomic consistency, their heads low against the constant, scouring wind that carried the fine grit of the interior. There were no landmarks here, only the sun by day and the cold, unblinking stars by night. Marco watched the way the light played tricks on the eyes, creating shimmering lakes where there was only parched stone, teaching him the ultimate lesson in desert patience, to trust only the path beneath one's feet. This was a land of ghosts and ancient winds. Marco listened to the tales told by the caravan guides, men whose skin was as weathered as the desert floor, about the voices of spirits that supposedly called out to the unwary, mimicking the cries of lost companions. He realized that the singing sands of the Gobi were a psychological test as much as a physical one. The journey had become a long, waking dream, a rhythmic movement through a void where time itself seemed to have stalled. They passed the skeletal remains of ancient way stations, half buried in the shifting gravel, serving as silent reminders of those who had passed this way centuries before. The slow, deliberate progress was the only thing tethering them to reality. As the month drew to a close, the air began to change, carrying a faint, unrecognizable scent of smoke and distant hearths. The absolute desolation of the central Gobi was beginning to soften into the scrublands that marked the northern frontiers. Marco felt a shift in the caravan spirit. The heavy, protective silence was replaced by a quiet, mounting anticipation. They were approaching the threshold of the great Khan's realm, a world that had been a mere rumor in the markets of Venice. The slow journey through the desert had been a purgatory of dust and light, stripping away the traveler's former self to prepare him for the wonders of the East. The transition from the lawless, whispering voids of the Gobi to the frontiers of the Mongol Empire was marked by a sudden, jarring sense of order. As the caravan crossed an invisible line in the dust, the landscape didn't change, but the atmosphere did. This was the month of the Yam, the great Khan's legendary postal system, where the slow, weary pace of the merchant caravan was suddenly contrasted by the blurring speed of imperial messengers. Marco watched in awe as a rider appeared on the horizon, a speck of dust that rapidly transformed into a man crowned in bells, his horse's hooves drumming a frantic rhythm against the hard-packed earth. Without stopping, the rider reached a fortified station, a post, and leaped onto a fresh mount, disappearing into the distance before the dust had even settled. The architecture of the frontier was utilitarian and imposing. In place of the crumbling mud-brick ruins of the desert, they now encountered well-maintained wooden and stone stations, each flying the fluttering silken banners of the Khan. Marco observed how the slow, cautious negotiations of the road were replaced by the cold efficiency of imperial bureaucracy. The Polos presented their pesa, a golden tablet of authority given by the Khan years prior, and the gates of the empire swung open with a silent, oiled precision. The young Venetian realized that they had entered a world where the will of one man dictated the movement of millions across a space larger than the sea. The people here were different from the mountain tribes or the desert traders. They moved with a quiet, disciplined confidence, their lives dictated by the strict laws of the Yasa. Marco spent his hours watching the Mongol guards, their faces like carved mahogany, sitting motionless atop their sturdy steppe ponies. There was no chaos in these border towns, the markets were organized, the taxes were recorded on scrolls of fine paper, and the very air seemed to vibrate with the authority of the throne. The slow journey had prepared Marco to notice these nuances, the way the soldiers' armor was lacquered to a high gloss, and the rhythmic, repetitive chanting of the keepers of the horse stations as they tallied the day's grain. As the nights fell over the northern grasslands, the camp felt safer than it had in years. The threat of bandits had evaporated, replaced by the shadow of the Khan's long arm. Marco sat by the fire, listening to the new sounds of the empire, the low, guttural throat singing of the guards and the distant, constant gallop of the night riders. He felt the immense weight of the civilization he was about to enter. The desert had been a trial of the spirit, but the empire was a trial of the mind. The slow, deliberate crawl toward the east was finally bringing him into the presence of a power that made the kings of Europe seem like distant children playing in the dirt. The transition from the gravelly reaches of the frontier to the rolling heart of the Mongolian steppe was a slow inundation of green. The air, once dry and choked with the metallic tang of desert dust, transformed into a cool, sweet breath smelling of crushed clover and wild scallions. This was the month of the verdant sea, where the horizon ceased to be a line of heat and became an endless, waving carpet of grass that shimmered like silk under a sky of impossible clarity. Marco observed how the heavy, swaying gait of the camels felt different here, their hooves no longer crunched on stone but thudded softly against the rich, dark soil of the high plains. Scattered across this emerald expanse like white pearls were the jares, the circular felt tents of the nomads. Marco watched the slow, rhythmic dance of a civilization in constant motion. These were not the permanent, brooding cities of Persia, but a world that could be packed onto the backs of oxen in an hour and vanished by sunset. He marveled at the grace of the nomadic women, their movements steady and practiced as they milked mares to produce kumis, the fermented milk that sustained the empire's warriors. The transition was complete. The Venetian youth, once accustomed to the stone canals and stagnant air of his home, was now immersed in a world defined by wind, grass, and the freedom of the open range. The social order of the steppe was a blend of ancient tradition and imperial discipline. Marco spent long afternoons observing the training of the young riders, children who seemed to have been born in the saddle, their small bodies moving in perfect unison with their horses. There was no shouting, only a series of low whistles and shifts in weight that guided the herds. He realized that the strength of the Khan lay not just in his cities, but in this inexhaustible reservoir of skilled, mobile people. The slow journey allowed him to see the intricacies of their life, the way the felt for the tents was pressed by hand, and the rhythmic, repetitive motion of the elders as they carved intricate designs into bone and wood. As evening descended, the steppe turned a deep, bruised violet, and the smoke from 1,000 hearths rose in straight, gray columns toward the first stars. The caravan would often rest near a princely encampment, where the sounds of the night were a symphony of lowing cattle and the distant, melodic plucking of a horsehead fiddle. Marco sat in the grass, feeling the immense pulse of the land beneath him. He was no longer a stranger looking in, the slow, deliberate pace of the Silk Road had synchronized his own internal clock with the vast, unhurried cycles of the East. The journey across the grass was a meditation on space and belonging, a final preparation for the shimmering urban wonders that lay just beyond the horizon. The air began to change once more, losing the wild, raw edge of the open steppe and taking on the refined, delicate sense of a cultivated paradise. As the caravan crested the final rise of the Mongolian plateau, the fabled summer capital of Xanadu, revealed itself not as a city, but as a dream constructed of marble and silk. This was the month of the golden arrival, where the slow, grueling miles of the past years finally converged upon a single point of unimaginable splendor. Marco watched as the horizon was pierced by the gilded spires of the palace, reflecting the afternoon sun with a brilliance that made the Venetian cathedrals of his memory seem like pale shadows. The transition from the rugged trail to the imperial grounds was a slow immersion into a world of curated beauty. The caravan moved along wide, paved avenues lined with exotic trees brought from the furthest reaches of the empire. Marco observed the high, silver-white walls that enclosed the Khan's private hunting grounds, where deer and rare birds moved through the meadows with a fearlessness that spoke of the absolute peace enforced by the sovereign. The rhythmic thud of the horses' hooves on the hard-packed road felt like a drumroll, building a quiet tension in the young traveler's chest. He noticed how his father and uncle straightened their backs, their faces tightening with a mixture of reverence and professional calm. Everything in Xanadu moved with a calculated, silent grace. The chaotic noise of the desert bazaars was replaced by the soft rustle of silk robes and the distant, haunting melody of bamboo flutes wafting from hidden gardens. Marco was mesmerized by the guards at the palace gates, men clad in armor of polished scales that shimmered like the skin of a dragon, standing as motionless as statues. He realized that this was the heart of the world's power, a place where the wild energy of the Mongol horsemen had been channeled into an exquisite, terrifyingly efficient court. The slow journey had been a long, deliberate ascent to this throne, a shedding of the mundane to prepare for the monumental. As they were led into the outer courts to await their summons, the scale of the architecture began to overwhelm the senses. Great halls of carved wood, painted in vibrant vermilion and deep azure, rose toward a sky that seemed bluer here than anywhere else on earth. Marco spent the final hours of the day watching the play of light on the palace's jade-encrusted roofs, his mind replaying the thousands of miles he had crossed to stand on this tile. The journey was no longer about the road, it was about the man at the end of it. In the cooling twilight of the east, amidst the scent of incense and exotic flowers, Marco Polo stood at the threshold of history, waiting for the doors to open and the real story to begin. The transition from the outdoor world to the inner sanctum of the Great Khan was a slow passage through layers of increasing silence and splendor. As the heavy, brass-bound doors of the great hall swung open, the air changed instantly. It was cool, still, and heavy with the scent of sandalwood and 100 burning beeswax candles. This was the month of the imperial mirror, where Marco finally stepped out of the dust of the road and into the crystalline world of the court. He walked on carpets so thick and soft they swallowed the sound of his footsteps, a stark contrast to the sharp clatter of mountain stones he had grown accustomed to over the past years. The hall was an ocean of gold and vermilion. High above, the ceiling was supported by colossal pillars wrapped in gilded dragons that seemed to writhe in the flickering light. Marco kept his gaze lowered as instructed, yet he could not help but notice the rows of courtiers and barons standing in absolute, motionless ranks, their silken robes creating a sea of shimmering colors, deep plum, emerald green, and imperial yellow. The slow pace of their approach felt like a ritual, each step deliberate, bringing them closer to the elevated dais where the master of half the world sat. There was no sound but the rhythmic, distant chime of a silver water clock. Then, there was the Khan himself. Kublai did not appear as the fierce barbarian of Western rumors, but as a man of immense, quiet gravity, his face a map of wisdom and absolute authority. He sat upon a throne of carved ivory, draped in cloth of gold that caught the light like a stagnant sun. Marco observed the Khan's eyes, dark, piercing, and unexpectedly curious. The transition from being a traveler to being a subject of the Khan's gaze was a moment of profound weight. The young Venetian realized that this man was the living center of the Silk Road, all the paths he had walked, all the deserts he had crossed, were merely the veins and arteries leading to this single beating heart. The ceremony of the greeting was a slow-motion dance of protocols. As his father and uncle performed the deep prostrations, Marco felt the immense scale of the empire pressing down on him. This wasn't just a kingdom, it was a global convergence. Behind the Khan stood guards from a dozen different nations, their faces a testament to the reach of Mongol power. Marco listened as the first words were exchanged in the courtly tongue, a low, melodic rumble that sounded like the wind over the steppe. In that moment, the thousands of miles of his journey were validated. He was no longer a merchant's son from a distant lagoon, he was a witness to a majesty that exceeded all human imagination, standing at the very pinnacle of the known world. The transition from the rural terraced hills to the outskirts of Qinsai, modern-day Hangzhou, was a slow immersion into a world where the distinction between land and water seemed to dissolve. As the imperial road widened, it merged into a landscape dominated by the shimmering expanse of the West Lake. This was the month of the Celestial Mirror, where Marco encountered what he would later call the most noble and magnificent city in the world. The air here was unlike any he had breathed before, it was soft, perpetually damp, and carried the intoxicating fragrance of lotus blossoms and expensive incense, a scent that clung to his silken envoy robes like a floral ghost. Marco moved through the city not with the haste of a messenger, but with the measured grace of a high-ranking official. He observed the 12,000 stone bridges that arched over a labyrinth of canals, their spans high enough for ships with tall masts to glide underneath. The slow, rhythmic rowing of the gondola-like boats created a constant, gentle percussion against the stone embankments. The architecture was a marvel of harmony, houses of carved wood and white plaster sat nestled among ancient weeping willows, their roofs curving toward the sky like the wings of birds in flight. It was a city that did not fight the water but floated upon it, a dream of stone and cedar reflected in 1,000 miles of still, dark canals. The life of the city was a masterpiece of organized abundance. Marco spent hours in the 10 principal marketplaces, squares so vast they could hold 40,000 people. He watched the slow, meticulous transactions of merchants dealing in spices from the islands and pearls from the southern seas. The sheer volume of goods was staggering, ocean-going vessels arrived daily, their holds filled with ginger, sugar, and more silk than Marco had seen in all of Europe. He noticed the inhabitants, whom he described as peaceful and refined, dressed in robes of the finest damask, moving through the streets with a quiet dignity that mirrored the stillness of the lake. There was no chaos here, only a rhythmic, tidal flow of commerce and leisure. As the sun dipped behind the hills, the city underwent a magical transformation. Thousands of lanterns were lit, their flickering gold spirits dancing on the surface of the water. Marco often found himself on one of the great pleasure barges that drifted across Westlake, watching the silhouette of the city against the violet sky. The sound of distant lutes and the soft laughter of revelers wafted across the water, blending with the rhythmic splashing of oars. In this city of heaven, the slow journey of the Silk Road reached its aesthetic zenith. Marco realized that he had found a place where human ingenuity and natural beauty had reached a perfect, stilled equilibrium, a destination that made the long years of dust and cold feel like a necessary purgatory for this celestial reward. The transition from the aesthetic dream of the West Lake to the inner workings of the city's industry was a slow descent into the mechanical heartbeat of the Khan's power. Marco moved from the pleasure barges to the shadowed corridors of the imperial workshops, where the air was thick with the scent of damp wood pulp and boiling brine. This was the month of the hidden gears, where he observed the systems that held the vast weight of Cathay together. He watched the rhythmic, repetitive motions of the craftsmen, not as individual laborers, but as part of a colossal, synchronized machine that produced goods on a scale that defied Western imagination. The most startling revelation was the creation of paper gold. Marco stood in the imperial mint, watching as the inner bark of the mulberry tree was steeped, pounded, and pressed into thick, dark sheets. These were then cut and stamped with the vermilion seal of the Great Khan. The slow, methodical process transformed mere bark into a currency that moved with the same authority as gold or silver across thousands of miles. He observed how merchants accepted these light, rustling slips of paper with total confidence, a psychological shift that fascinated the Venetian mind. It was a world where value was not found in the weight of a coin, but in the rhythmic reliability of the emperor's word. Beyond the mints, the city's salt industry operated with a different, more industrial cadence. Marco traveled to the outskirts where the Great Canal met the salt marshes. He watched the workers as they boiled seawater in massive iron vats, the steam rising in thick, white plumes that mingled with the coastal mist. The slow crystallization of the salt, the white gold of the empire, was a source of immense revenue for the Khan. Every basket filled and every seal applied was a heartbeat in the economic life of the city. Marco spent days recording the tallies, his brush moving in sync with the rhythmic pouring of the grains, realizing that the beauty of Hangzhou was built upon this foundation of meticulous, tireless production. As the day's work wound down, the city did not fall silent, but shifted its rhythm. The heavy thud of the paper presses and the hiss of the salt vats gave way to the steady scratching of pens in the administrative offices. Marco sat among the clerks, watching as they organized the census and the tax records of millions. The slow, deliberate pace of the bureaucracy was the true glue of the Silk Road. In the quiet of the evening, as the lanterns flickered over the ledgers, he felt the immense, invisible threads of the empire tightening. He was no longer just a witness to wonders, he was a student of the most sophisticated social engine ever devised, a system where every grain of salt and every sheet of paper was a testament to the Khan's absolute, unhurried control. The transition from the manicured canals of Hangzhou to the wild, vertical jungles of the southern frontier was a slow descent into a primal green. As the imperial road wound southward into the province of Yunnan, the humid, salty air of the coast was replaced by a thick, suffocating heat that smelled of rotting vegetation and exotic, waxy flowers. This was the month of the verdant shadow, where the sky was often hidden by a triple canopy of ancient trees, and the light that reached the forest floor was filtered into a ghostly, emerald dusk. Marco observed how the horses, so reliable on the northern plains, struggled in the swampy terrain, their hooves sinking into a soil that felt alive with moisture. The architecture of the south was a radical departure from the stone and tile of the north. Here, villages were built on high stilts made of black antique, rising above the treacherous forest floor where the monsoon rains gathered in stagnant pools. Marco watched the rhythmic movement of the local tribes, people who adorned themselves with tattoos of dragons and wore heavy ornaments of silver and gold. The slow pace of the journey was dictated by the dense undergrowth. The caravan often had to wait for hours as scouts cleared a path through vines that grew with an almost visible speed. The silence of the jungle was never truly silent, it was a constant, pulsating drone of insects and the distant, territorial screams of macaques. This was the land of the gold teeth and the legendary elephants of the kingdom of Ming. Marco spent days observing these grey giants, their slow, deliberate footsteps shaking the earth as they carried heavy loads of timber and spice through the forest. He marveled at how the mahouts guided the beasts with a simple touch of the hook behind the ear, a rhythmic communication between man and beast that had remained unchanged for centuries. The transition was psychological as well as physical. Marco felt the rigid order of the Khan central administration softening here, replaced by a world of spirits, mountain gods, and the raw, unhurried laws of the tropics. As the sun set, the jungle breathed. The heat did not dissipate but became a heavy blanket, filled with the flickering lights of fireflies that mirrored the stars hidden by the canopy. Marco sat on the porch of a bamboo longhouse, watching the smoke from mosquito-repellent coils curl into the humid air. He recorded the strange customs he witnessed, the use of cowrie shells as currency and the mysterious potions brewed by local shamans. The slow journey into Yunnan had brought him to the very edge of the Great Khan's reach, a place where the empire met the untamable wild, and where the rhythmic pulse of the Silk Road was nearly drowned out by the heartbeat of the earth itself. The transition from the quiet, emerald gloom of the jungle to the open theaters of war was marked by a slow, rhythmic pounding that vibrated through the very soles of Marco's boots. As the Khan's provincial forces moved toward the borders of the Kingdom of Ming, the air grew thick with the smell of iron and wood smoke. This was the month of the shaking earth, where the peace of the envoy was replaced by the terrifying discipline of the military. Marco watched as the Mongol archers, far from their familiar plains, adapted to the humid heat, their composite bows kept in silk cases to protect the glue from the moisture. They moved with a predatory stillness, a stark contrast to the chaotic, vibrant energy of the southern armies gathering on the horizon. Then came the elephants. Emerging from the tree line like slow-moving gray fortresses, the war elephants of Ming were a sight that momentarily froze the breath in Marco's chest. He observed the transition in the landscape as hundreds of these beasts moved into position, their tusks capped with steel and their backs supporting wooden towers filled with archers and pikemen. The slow, deliberate gait of the elephants gave them an aura of invincibility, a living wall of muscle and bone that seemed destined to crush the smaller Mongol ponies. Marco watched the mahouts, their bodies leaning in sync with the great animals, as they guided this prehistoric force toward the imperial lines. The battle itself was not a sudden clash, but a slow, agonizing tactical dance. Marco noticed how the Mongol horses initially recoiled in terror at the scent of the elephants, their instincts screaming to flee the unknown giants. The transition to victory required a cold, rhythmic patience. The Mongol commanders ordered their men to dismount and hitch their horses to the trees, then move forward on foot. Marco watched as the air became a solid wall of whistling arrows, a relentless, metronomic rain that targeted the elephants' sensitive trunks and eyes. The slow advance of the gray mountains was halted by 1,000 stinging needles, turning the elephants' deliberate movements into a panicked, crushing retreat. As the dust and the screams of the wounded animals began to settle, the jungle reclaimed its heavy silence. Marco walked across the battlefield, observing the fallen giants, their gray skin now a map of the archer's precision. He realized that even the most formidable force of nature could be dismantled by the disciplined, rhythmic persistence of the Khan's machine. The transition back to the road was somber. The slow journey had shown him the heights of civilization in Hangzhou and now the depths of its violence in Yunnan. Sitting by a fire that evening, he recorded the sheer scale of the carnage, his hand steady but his mind forever changed by the sight of the thundering mountains that had been brought to their knees. The transition from the wild, chaotic fringes of the southern jungles back to the imperial core was a slow re-entry into a world of perfect angles and frozen silence. As the months of travel brought the caravan toward the Great Khan's winter capital, Kanbalik, the humid air of Yunnan was replaced by the razor-sharp, dry cold of the northern plains. This was the month of the celestial compass, where the landscape ceased to be organic and became a masterpiece of human design. Marco watched as the horizon was broken by the colossal, dark walls of the city, which rose from the earth like a man-made mountain range, perfectly square and aligned with the cardinal points of the universe. Everything in Kanbalik moved with a rhythmic, geometric precision. Marco observed how the streets were laid out like a giant chessboard, wide and straight enough for a dozen horsemen to ride abreast without breaking formation. The slow pace of his horse through the city gates felt like a movement through a series of interlocking boxes. He was struck by the transition from the winding, organic alleys of Venice to this intentional, sprawling order. The architecture here was not merely for shelter, it was a physical manifestation of the Khan's cosmic authority. Marco spent his days tracing the line of the walls, which were topped with white battlements that glittered under the pale winter sun like teeth of ice. At the center of this world lay the Forbidden City, a palace of such scale that it felt like a city within a city. Marco observed the transition into the inner sanctum, where the roofs were tiled in a vibrant, glazed yellow that only the emperor could claim. The slow, deliberate movements of the palace guards, dressed in silks that matched the architecture, created a sense of timelessness. He watched the great water clocks in the public squares, their rhythmic dripping the only sound in a city that seemed to hold its breath in the presence of the Khan. The air here was thin and brittle, carrying the faint scent of coal smoke and the heavy, musky aroma of the imperial stables. As the winter nights deepened, the city turned into a fortress of light. Marco sat in the high galleries of the palace, watching the thousands of lanterns that outlined the grid of the streets below. The absolute silence of the northern winter was a profound contrast to the screaming jungles of the south. He realized that the Silk Road had led him to the ultimate expression of power, a city where even the wind seemed to follow the street's straight lines. The slow journey had brought him to this cold, perfect center, where the heartbeat of the empire was most visible, pulsing in the rhythmic changing of the guards and the steady, unhurried flow of the world's wealth through the city's 12 gates. The transition from the everyday geometric order of Kanbalik to the spectacle of the White Feast was a slow, dazzling inundation of the senses. This was the month of the lunar rebirth, the start of the new year, where the entire city shed its winter grays and donned the color of purity and luck. Marco watched as the streets, normally a sober grid of commerce, were transformed into rivers of white silk. Every citizen, from the highest prince to the humblest clerk, was dressed in snowy robes, creating a visual rhythm that made the city appear as if a gentle, unmelting frost had settled over its heart. The focus of this month was the great hall of the palace, a space so vast it could seat 6,000 guests at once. Marco observed the slow, ritualistic arrival of the tributary kings and ambassadors, each bearing gifts that represented the furthest reaches of the world, white camels laden with spice, jars of gold dust, and bundles of rare furs. The transition into the feast was marked by the entrance of the Khan's 5,000 elephants, draped in housings of worked silk and carrying chests of silver plate. The rhythmic, heavy tread of the beasts against the palace tiles was like a drumbeat that vibrated in the chests of all who watched. At the center of the hall stood a magnificent vessel of pure gold, a fountain that dispensed wine and fermented mare's milk through the mouths of golden lions. Marco watched the slow, orderly movement of the cupbearers, their mouths covered with silk veils so that their breath would not touch the emperor's drink. There was no chaotic revelry, the celebration was a masterpiece of discipline. Every toast was synchronized, every bow performed in unison. The young Venetian marveled at the lion that was led into the hall, which would crouch before the Khan with such humility it seemed more a lapdog than a predator, a living symbol of the sovereign's power over the wild. As the night progressed, the air inside the hall grew warm and sweet with the smell of roasting meats and burning incense. Marco sat among the officials, watching the performers, conjurers who made flowers bloom in the middle of winter and acrobats who seemed to defy the very laws of gravity. He realized that the White Feast was not just a party, but a reaffirmation of the cosmic order. The slow, deliberate pace of the ceremony reflected the Khan's belief that his empire was as steady and predictable as the cycles of the moon. In the heart of the frozen north, surrounded by a sea of white silk, Marco felt the immense, quiet confidence of a civilization that believed it had reached the peak of human achievement. The transition from the material splendor of the court to the spiritual landscape of the empire was a slow, contemplative journey through the minds of its people. As Marco traveled between the capital and the provinces, he observed a phenomenon that was perhaps the greatest wonder of the Silk Road, the peaceful coexistence of gods. This was the month of the silent dialogue, where the air was filled with a polyphony of bells, gongs, and calls to prayer. In the same street where a Buddhist monk in saffron robes walked with rhythmic, meditative steps, an Nestorian Christian priest might be seen carrying a silver cross, while the aromatic smoke of a mosque's incense drifted over them both. Marco watched the great Khan's approach to these faiths with a fascination born of his own rigid European upbringing. In the West, religion was a cause for war; here, under the Mongol peace, it was a matter of statecraft. He observed how Kublai Khan treated the leaders of every faith with a calculated, rhythmic respect, inviting lamas, imams, and bishops to his table to debate the nature of the soul. The transition between these worlds was seamless. Marco visited the great Buddhist monasteries where the slow, repetitive chanting of thousands of monks created a vibration that seemed to make the very mountains hum. He marveled at the giant reclining Buddhas, their gilded faces reflecting a serenity that the young Venetian had never encountered in the tormented icons of his home. The architecture of faith along the Silk Road was a study in adaptation. Marco saw Christian churches built with the sweeping, upturned eaves of Chinese pagodas and mosques decorated with the intricate geometric tiles of Persia but standing amidst the bamboo groves of Cathay. The slow pace of his travels allowed him to see the subtle ways these religions bled into one another, the way a nomadic traveler might offer a prayer to the Virgin Mary and then tie a spirit ribbon to a sacred tree on the steppe. He realized that for the Khan, the heavens were like his empire, a vast territory with many provinces, each speaking a different language but all ultimately answering to the same central authority. As the sun set over the diverse skyline of a trading city like Chuanzhou, the blending of these worlds became a visual masterpiece. The silhouette of a minaret stood side by side with the tiered roof of a Taoist temple, both fading into the same indigo sky. Marco sat in the quiet of a Nestorian monastery, listening to the rhythmic tolling of a bell that sounded exactly like the ones in Venice, yet looking out over a garden of lotus and peony. He felt the immense weight of his own narrow history beginning to lift. The slow journey had taught him that the world was not a battlefield of competing truths, but a vast, shimmering tapestry where every thread of faith was part of a single, unhurried design. The transition from the grand halls of power to the intimate tea houses of the South was a slow, aromatic descent into the soul of Cathay. While the Khan's court was built on the scale of giants, the social fabric of the people was held together by something as delicate as a dried leaf. This was the month of the rising steam, where Marco began to understand that in the East, time was not measured by the sun, but by the slow, rhythmic brewing of tea. He observed how the chaotic energy of the marketplace would instantly soften as people stepped into the wooden pavilions that overhung the green-scummed canals. The process of tea-making was a choreography of patience. Marco watched the tea masters as they handled the leaves, small, curled fragments of the hills, with the reverence usually reserved for jade. The transition from dry leaf to golden liquid was a study in precision. He observed the rhythmic pouring of boiling water from long-necked iron kettles, the steam rising in white plumes that smelled of mountain mist and toasted chestnuts. There was no haste in these houses. The act of drinking was a shared silence, a pause in the long journey of the day that allowed the spirit to catch up with the body. Beyond the social ritual, Marco marveled at the sheer scale of the tea industry. He traveled to the terraced hillsides where the bushes grew in orderly, emerald waves. He watched the pickers, mostly women with weathered hands, as they moved through the rows with a rhythmic, plucking motion that seemed as old as the earth itself. These leaves were then dried in great copper pans over charcoal fires, a process that filled the valleys with a sweet, heavy scent. He realized that tea was the invisible fuel of the empire, a currency of hospitality that smoothed the friction of trade and the weariness of travel. As the afternoon light slanted through the paper screens of a tea house, Marco sat with his porcelain bowl, feeling the warmth seep into his palms. He noticed how the tea changed color as it steeped, from a pale primrose to a deep, glowing amber. The slow, deliberate sips became a meditation. In Venice, wine was for celebration and heat; here, tea was for clarity and cool reflection. He recorded in his journals the different varieties, the dark, fermented cakes of the borderlands and the delicate, silvery buds of the imperial gardens. The slow journey of the leaf from the mountain slope to the porcelain cup was a microcosm of the Silk Road itself, a transformation born of time, fire, and a steady, unhurried hand. The transition from the inland riverways to the great port city of Zayton, modern-day Chuanzhou, was a slow expansion of the horizon. As the caravan reached the coast, the air lost its scent of forest and tea, replaced by the sharp, bracing tang of salt and the smell of sun-baked pitch. This was the month of the rising tide, where Marco prepared to trade the steady rhythm of a horse's gait for the unpredictable roll of the ocean. He stood on the stone wharfs and looked out at a forest of masts so dense it seemed to bridge the gap between the land and the sky. The most breathtaking sight was the ships themselves, the great Khan's maritime giants. Marco observed these massive wooden hulls, which were unlike any vessel ever seen in the Mediterranean. These were ships of 4 masts and up to a dozen sails made of woven bamboo laths. He marveled at the innovation of watertight compartments. The hull was divided into sections so that a leak in one would not sink the whole. The slow, rhythmic hammering of the shipwrights echoed across the harbor as they caulked the seams with a mixture of lime and hemp oil. The life of the port was a masterpiece of global synchronization. Marco watched the loading of the ships, a process that took weeks of tireless, organized effort. Huge cranes of timber and rope lowered crates of porcelain, wrapped in straw to survive the journey, and heavy bales of silk into the deep holds. The transition from merchant to mariner required a new kind of patience. He spent his days among the sailors, men from the islands of Java, India, and the Arabian coast, learning the language of the monsoons and the patterns of the stars that would guide them through the 7 seas. As the day of departure approached, the city of Zayton felt like a coiled spring. The slow accumulation of wealth from the heart of Cathay was now being funneled into these floating cities. Marco sat on the pier, watching the sunset turn the massive sails into sheets of hammered gold. He felt a bittersweet pang. He was leaving the empire that had become his home for 17 years, yet the pull of the distant west was beginning to stir in his blood. The journey home would not be a path of dust and mountains, but a voyage across the blue void, propelled by the same relentless, rhythmic spirit that had brought him to the feet of the great Khan. The transition from the solid stone wharfs of Zayton to the living, groaning decks of the treasure junk was a slow surrender to the rhythm of the tides. As the fleet of 14 ships, each carrying hundreds of souls, weighed anchor, the city receded into a golden haze. This was the month of the changing wind, where the fleet waited for the onset of the winter monsoon to push them south. Marco observed how the massive bamboo sails didn't luff like the canvas of Venice but rose with a dry, rhythmic clatter, catching the wind like the wings of a great bird. Navigation in these waters was a sophisticated dance of science and tradition. Marco spent his hours on the high stern castle, watching the pilots use the south-pointing needle, a magnetic compass floating in a bowl of water, and the kamal, a simple wooden block used to measure the height of the stars. The transition from the landmarks of the Silk Road to the featureless blue of the South China Sea was daunting. He realized that the ocean was not a void, but a complex map of currents and seasonal winds that the Khan's mariners read like a well-worn scroll. The fleet moved past the coast of Kampa, Vietnam, and toward the dense, spice-scented islands of the East Indies. The air became heavy with the smell of cloves and nutmeg, a scent so powerful it seemed to drift miles out to sea. Marco watched the change in the water, from the deep indigo of the open ocean to the pale, milky turquoise of the coral reefs near the Malay Peninsula. The slow, rhythmic creaking of the ship's timbers became the heartbeat of his existence. He recorded the sights of strange creatures, unicorns, that were actually rhinoceroses, and giant nuts, coconuts, filled with sweet milk that the sailors used to stave off thirst. As they navigated the narrow straits of Malacca, the tension on board grew. These waters were a labyrinth of hidden shoals and pirate coves. The fleet moved in a tight, disciplined formation, the rhythmic signaling of gongs and colored lanterns at night keeping the vessels together in the dark. Marco sat on the deck, watching the phosphorescence churned up by the ship's wake, a trail of cold fire leading back toward the empire he had left behind. The journey was no longer measured in miles, but in the slow, inexorable turning of the seasons, as they moved closer to the great crossroads of the Indian Ocean. The transition from the open, rolling swells of the Bay of Bengal to the emerald embrace of Ceylon, Sri Lanka, was a slow, fragrant arrival. As the fleet approached the island, the salt spray of the ocean was gradually overtaken by a scent so sweet and heavy it seemed to coat the tongue, the scent of cinnamon forests and damp earth. This was the month of the Sacred Mountain, where the travelers left the confines of their wooden hulls to step onto a land that many in the East believed was the site of the original paradise. Marco observed how the earth here was not just soil, but a treasury. After heavy rains, the locals would sift through the mountain streams to find rubies, sapphires, and amethysts washed down from the heights. The architectural and spiritual center of the island was Adam's Peak, a mountain that rose in a perfect, lonely cone toward the clouds. Marco watched the slow, rhythmic procession of pilgrims, Buddhists, Hindus, and Muslims alike, who climbed the thousands of rock-cut steps to reach the summit. He recorded the legend of the sacred footprint found at the peak, which each faith claimed as their own. The transition from the pragmatic bureaucracy of the Khan's court to this island of mysticism was profound. Marco spent his time observing the local king, who possessed the greatest ruby in the world, a stone as long as a man's hand and as red as a glowing coal, which the Khan had offered an entire city to possess, only to be refused. The life of the island moved to the rhythm of the monsoon and the harvest. Marco observed the peeling of the cinnamon bark, a delicate, rhythmic labor where the outer skin of the branches was stripped away to reveal the aromatic inner layer that would be dried into the scrolls prized in the kitchens of Europe. He was struck by the contrast between the gentle, peaceful nature of the Ceylonese people and the wild, untamed power of the island's elephants, which were considered the most noble and intelligent in all of Asia. The transition was sensory. He traded the dried meats of the ship for the fresh fruits of the jungle, the jackfruit and the mango, and the cool, clear water of the mountain springs. As the fleet prepared to depart for the coast of India, Marco stood on the shore, watching the sun set behind the silhouette of Adam's Peak. The slow journey had brought him to a place where the line between myth and reality was paper-thin. He realized that Ceylon was the final jewel on the string of his eastern travels. Ahead lay the Malabar coast and the long trek toward the Persian Gulf, but the memory of the red stones and the cinnamon-scented air would remain with him as the ultimate symbol of the East's inexhaustible riches. The rhythmic pulse of the ocean was calling again, pulling him further west toward a home that now felt more like a distant dream than a reality. The transition from the mystical heights of Ceylon to the Malabar coast of India was a slow immersion into a world of heat, gold, and the dizzying scent of black pepper. As the ships glided into the busy harbors of the western coast, the air became thick with a new kind of energy, a frantic, rhythmic commerce that had drawn traders from across the globe for millennia. This was the month of the black gold, where the world's supply of pepper was harvested and weighed. Marco observed the hillsides covered in climbing vines, their small, dark berries drying in the sun until they became the wrinkled, pungent grains that commanded their weight in silver in the markets of Venice. The social landscape of India was a labyrinth of tradition that fascinated and bewildered the Venetian envoy. Marco observed the Brahmins, the priestly caste, with their rhythmic rituals of purification and their strict avoidance of meat and wine. He was particularly struck by the yogis, ascetics who lived for over 100 years through extreme temperance and the consumption of a strange mixture of sulfur and quicksilver. The transition from the Mongol logic of power through conquest to the Indian logic of power through spirit and caste was profound. He watched the pearl divers of the Gulf of Mannar, who used shark charmers to keep the predators at bay while they descended into the deep on a single breath, a rhythmic, dangerous dance with the sea. The architecture of Malabar was open and airy, designed to catch the fleeting monsoon breezes. Marco visited temples carved from solid rock, their walls a teeming forest of stone deities, each limb and expression caught in a moment of eternal, rhythmic movement. He noted the local kings, who went nearly naked save for collars of rubies and diamonds that would buy a European city. The transition was psychological. Marco realized that India was not one country, but a kaleidoscope of kingdoms, each with its own language and gods, held together by the gravity of trade and the unrelenting sun. As the fleet prepared for the final, long leg across the Arabian Sea toward Persia, Marco sat on the deck, surrounded by the sacks of pepper and ginger that now filled the holds. The slow journey through India had been a lesson in the complexity of the human spirit. He watched the local sailors chanting in unison as they hauled the anchors, their voices a rhythmic bridge between the land and the deep water. The East was behind him now, its scents and colors woven into his very soul. Ahead lay the familiar shores of the Middle East, but the Marco who returned would never again see the world through the narrow eyes of the youth who had left Venice so many years ago. The transition from the lush, spice-scented air of India to the parched, metallic heat of the Persian Gulf was a slow and sobering homecoming. As the fleet rounded the rugged cliffs of the Arabian Peninsula and entered the Strait of Hormuz, the vibrant greens of the tropics vanished, replaced by the jagged, sun-bleached rock of the desert. This was the month of the dusty mirror, where the reflection of the sun on the water was so bright it stung the eyes. Marco stood on the prow of the lead junk, looking for the familiar silhouettes of the port he had passed through nearly 20 years ago. However, as the ships dropped anchor in the harbor of Ormuz, the rhythmic joy of the homecoming was dampened by a cold reality. The world had not waited for them. The transition from the stability of Kublai Khan's empire to the fractured politics of the Ilkhanate was immediate. They were met not with imperial honors, but with the grim news of war and succession. The great Khan, the sun around which Marco's world had revolved for nearly 2 decades, was dead. The empire was stretching and cracking under the weight of rival claimants, and the safe passage they had once enjoyed was now a gauntlet of shifting loyalties. The architecture of Ormuz felt smaller and more desperate than Marco remembered. The wind, known as the Samum, blew with a rhythmic, scorching intensity, forcing the inhabitants to retreat into their wind-catcher towers to survive the midday heat. Marco observed the transition in his father and uncle. The men who had been confident advisors to the world's most powerful monarch were now guarded and weary, clutching their golden tablets of authority, Pesa, as if they were shields against the encroaching chaos. They learned that the princess they had escorted from Cathay was to be wed not to the king who requested her, but to his son, as the father had passed away during their 3-year voyage. As the sun set over the jagged hills of Persia, turning the gulf into a pool of dark violet, Marco felt the finality of the journey. The slow, rhythmic pulse of the Silk Road was being overtaken by the erratic heartbeat of a world in transition. He sat in a stone caravanserai, the scent of desert dust replacing the aroma of cloves. The mission was complete, but the return journey to Venice now loomed as a dangerous trek through a crumbling landscape. He realized that the Pax Mongolica was fading, and with it, the bridge between East and West was beginning to burn. The transition from the sun-scorched plains of the East to the cool, salt-misted air of the Adriatic was the final, most disorienting shift of Marco's life. In the year 1295, a small, weary galley glided into the Venetian lagoon. The air here was heavy with the smell of stagnant water and rotting wood, a scent that felt alien after decades of sandalwood and mountain air. This was the month of the forgotten sun, where the rhythmic lapping of the Venetian tide against the stone piers sounded like a language Marco had almost forgotten how to speak. As the 3 men stepped onto the quay, they were a spectacle of strangeness. Their skin was bronzed to a deep leather by the suns of a dozen climates, and they were dressed in coarse, travel-stained robes of Tartar silk that had been patched so many times they looked like a mosaic of the Silk Road itself. Marco observed his family's ancestral home, the Kublai Polo. The architecture felt cramped and brooding compared to the sprawling marble palaces of Kenbalik. When they knocked on the door, the transition was complete. Their own kin looked upon them with suspicion and fear, unable to see the young men who had left 24 years ago in these scarred, bearded foreigners who spoke Venetian with a thick, Eastern lilt. The legend tells of a final, rhythmic ritual to prove their identity. The Polos invited their relatives to a great feast. In a theatrical transition, they removed their tattered rags to reveal magnificent robes of crimson velvet, only to cut the seams of their old travel coats. From the hidden linings, a rhythmic rain of jewels cascaded onto the table, rubies from Ceylon, emeralds from the Hindu Kush, and diamonds from the Indian mines. The sound of the stones hitting the wood was the final proof. The Millie One, as Marco would come to be known, had returned not just with stories, but with the concentrated wealth of an empire the West could barely conceive of. Marco sat by the window of his room, watching the gondolas move with their slow, rhythmic strokes through the canals. He was home, yet he was a stranger. His mind was still navigating the Gobi, still sitting at the feet of the great Khan, still smelling the incense of Hangzhou. The slow journey had ended, but the story was just beginning. Soon, a war with Genoa would land him in a prison cell, where he would meet a writer named Rustic Hello and begin the rhythmic dictation of his travels. He realized then that he hadn't just traveled across the world, he had brought the world back with him. The Silk Road was no longer a path of dust, but a bridge of words that would change the map of the human imagination forever. The transition from the luxury of a Venetian palazzo to the damp chill of a prison cell was a sharp and agonizing shift. In 1298, just 3 years after his return, Marco was captured during a naval battle between Venice and its bitter rival, Genoa. This was the month of the Iron Grate, where the vast horizons of the Mongolian steppe were replaced by the suffocating stone walls of a Genoese dungeon. The rhythmic lapping of the waves now reached him only through a narrow slit in the masonry, a haunting reminder of the sea that had once been his highway. It was here, in the silence of captivity, that Marco met the man who would help him change the world, Rustic Hello of Pisa, a writer of Arthurian romances. The transition from memory to text became Marco's lifeline. He began to dictate his adventures, his voice, once used to command in Mongolian and haggle in the bazaars of India, now rhythmically weaving the tale of Eastern wonders. Rustic Hello wrote it all down in Franco-Italian, infusing Marco's dry observations with the romantic flair of medieval storytelling. Marco described things that Europeans considered madness: black stones that burned like wood, coal, cities of millions, and paper slips that held the power of gold. The prison fell into a specific rhythm: the scratch of Rusticello's quill on parchment, the jingle of the jailer's keys, and Marco's endless stories that drew other prisoners to his cell door, listening with open mouths. They began to call him Messer Milione, the man of a million lies, or a million marvels, depending on who was listening. This prison cell became a cocoon where the traveler's experiences were forged into the book The Travels of Marco Polo. Marco realized that his journey had not ended in Venice, it continued here, in these words. Each line was a thread reconnecting him to Kublai Khan and the golden roofs of Xanadu. The slow, heavy pace of prison life gave him the time to realize that he had seen more than any man of his era, and his duty was now to make the world see it through his eyes. The transition from the isolation of the dungeon to the bustling scriptoria of Europe was a slow, viral spread of ideas. When Marco was finally released from prison in 1299, he returned to Venice, but his stories remained behind in the form of hand-copied manuscripts. This was the month of the ink and parchment, where the rhythm of the printing press was still centuries away, yet the demand for his book created a manual industry of reproduction. Marco observed how his tales of the East were treated as both a sensation and a scandal. To many, his descriptions of a civilization superior to their own were nothing more than the fevered dreams of a captive. Yet, while the common folk scoffed, the scholars and mapmakers were listening. Marco watched the slow transition of the world map, the Mappa Mundi. The blank, terrifying spaces of the East were beginning to be filled with the names he had brought back: Cathay, Cipangu, and Java. The rhythmic work of the cartographers changed. They began to stretch the borders of the known world, realizing that the ocean they thought was an endless abyss was actually a bridge to the riches Marco described. He sat in his Venetian study, surrounded by the letters of curious princes and the charts of navigators, realizing his words were acting as a silent, unhurried compass for the next generation. Even as he grew older, the rhythm of his life remained tied to the East. He traded in the marketplace of Rialto, but in his mind, he was still assessing the quality of silks in Suzhou. He noticed the transition in European trade. Merchant galleys began to seek out the spices and techniques he had documented. The skepticism of his neighbors, who often teased him to admit the lies in his book, became a background noise to the growing reality of global connection. Marco remained steadfast, his patience as enduring as the Great Wall he had once seen, knowing that time would eventually prove his millions to be mere facts. As the years slowed his gait, Marco became a living monument. He was a bridge between two worlds that had not yet fully touched. He observed the young sailors in the harbor, their eyes bright with the same hunger for the horizon that had driven him as a boy of 17. He realized that the greatest achievement of his long journey was not the jewels he had sewn into his coat, but the spark of curiosity he had ignited in the Western soul. The slow, rhythmic turning of the pages of his book across Europe was the sound of a world waking up, preparing for an age where the ends of the earth would finally meet. The transition from the active vigor of a merchant to the quiet stillness of the sickbed was Marco's final, most personal journey. By January 1324, the winter chill of Venice had settled deep into his aging bones. At nearly 70 years old, Marco lay in his home near San Giovanni Grisostamo, the rhythmic tolling of church bells marking the hours of a life that had spanned continents. This was the month of the Great Reckoning, where the priest and the notary stood by his side, ready to record his final will and, perhaps, a final apology for the tall tales that had defined his reputation. His family and friends gathered around, their faces illuminated by the flickering light of beeswax candles. Even at the threshold of death, the skepticism of the West pursued him. They leaned in, whispering for him to save his soul by admitting that his book was filled with exaggerations, that no city had 12,000 bridges, and no emperor possessed a fountain of wine. Marco watched them with a slow, weary smile. The transition from the physical world to the spiritual did not frighten him, he had already lived a dozen lives in one. Taking a final, rhythmic breath that seemed to carry the dust of the Gobi and the salt of the Indian Ocean, Marco looked at the doubters. He did not recant. Instead, he uttered the words that would echo through history, "I have not told half of what I saw." In that moment, the weight of his legacy shifted. He wasn't a man who had lied to make himself great, he was a man who had simplified the truth because the reality of the East was too vast for the Western mind to grasp. As the notary's quill scratched out his final wishes, freeing his Tartar slave, who had followed him from the steppes and dividing his wealth among his daughters, Marco drifted into the final silence. The rhythm of his heart, which had pulsed in sync with the great Khan's drums and the monsoon winds, finally came to a rest. He left behind a world that was now irrevocably smaller and more connected. The man died, but the bridge he had built remained, a testament to the fact that the greatest wonders are often those that are the hardest to believe. The transition from the man of flesh and bone to the man of myth and folklore happened with the slow, inevitable rhythm of a changing tide. After Marco's funeral at the church of San Lorenzo, Venice did not mourn him as a prophet, but remembered him as a character. This was the era of the living masquerade, where the name Milione was no longer just a nickname for his family's wealth, it became a staple of the Venetian carnival. Marco observed, perhaps from the beyond, as actors donned masks and colorful robes to play him in street comedies, exaggerating his stories into slapstick routines for the amusement of the crowds. In the decades following his death, the transition of his book from a travelogue to a legend was completed. While scholars used his data to refine the Catalan Atlas, the general public treated his adventures as a precursor to the tall tales of Baron Munchausen. The rhythmic skepticism of the medieval mind was a powerful force. It was easier to believe in monsters and dragons at the edge of the world than in a sophisticated postal system or the use of coal. Yet, beneath the mockery, a seed had been planted. Every time a merchant weighed a grain of pepper or touched a scrap of silk, the ghost of Marco Polo was there, whispering of the vast source from which these treasures flowed. The architecture of his legacy was built on this duality. On one hand, he was the Prince of Liars, a comic figure of excess. On the other, he was the silent mentor to the most ambitious minds of the coming Renaissance. Marco's daughter, Fantina, had to fight rhythmic legal battles to protect her father's estate and his reputation, ensuring that the milioni he left behind, both in jewels and in truth, remained in the family. The slow process of history began to filter the myth from the man, as other travelers followed his path and returned with the same incredible reports, confirming that the lion Marco had described was indeed a lion. As the 14th century matured into the 15th, the rhythm of exploration accelerated. The stories that were once told for entertainment in prison cells were now being studied with desperate intensity by royal courts. The transition was clear, Marco Polo had moved from being a curiosity of the past to a herald of the future. He had become the archetype of the explorer, the man who crosses the threshold into the unknown and returns to tell the tale. His life had shown that the world was not a collection of isolated islands of civilization, but a single, rhythmic heartbeat of trade and humanity, waiting for the bold to bridge the gap. The transition from the man of flesh and bone to the man of myth and folklore happened with the slow, inevitable rhythm of a changing tide. After Marco's funeral at the church of San Lorenzo, Venice did not mourn him as a prophet, but remembered him as a character. This was the era of the living masquerade, where the name Milione was no longer just a nickname for his family's wealth, it became a staple of the Venetian carnival. Marco observed, perhaps from the beyond, as actors donned masks and colorful robes to play him in street comedies, exaggerating his stories into slapstick routines for the amusement of the crowds. In the decades following his death, the transition of his book from a travelogue to a legend was completed. While scholars used his data to refine the Catalan Atlas, the general public treated his adventures as a precursor to the tall tales of Baron Munchausen. The rhythmic skepticism of the medieval mind was a powerful force. It was easier to believe in monsters and dragons at the edge of the world than in a sophisticated postal system or the use of coal. Yet, beneath the mockery, a seed had been planted. Every time a merchant weighed a grain of pepper or touched a scrap of silk, the ghost of Marco Polo was there, whispering of the vast source from which these treasures flowed. The architecture of his legacy was built on this duality. On one hand, he was the Prince of Liars, a comic figure of excess. On the other, he was the silent mentor to the most ambitious minds of the coming Renaissance. Marco's daughter, Fantina, had to fight rhythmic legal battles to protect her father's estate and his reputation, ensuring that the milioni he left behind, both in jewels and in truth, remained in the family. The slow process of history began to filter the myth from the man, as other travelers followed his path and returned with the same incredible reports, confirming that the lion Marco had described was indeed a lion. As the 14th century matured into the 15th, the rhythm of exploration accelerated. The stories that were once told for entertainment in prison cells were now being studied with desperate intensity by royal courts. The transition was clear. Marco Polo had moved from being a curiosity of the past to a herald of the future. He had become the archetype of the explorer, the man who crosses the threshold into the unknown and returns to tell the tale. His life had shown that the world was not a collection of isolated islands of civilization, but a single, rhythmic heartbeat of trade and humanity, waiting for the bold to bridge the gap.